Hi everyone, welcome to today's video. It's me, Daisy. We are answering all of your questions about the Pilot Signature Nib. So we recently did a video basically explaining the Pilot Signature Nib, which is Pilot's newest nib that was released a couple of years ago, and it is the 16th type of nib to appear on Pilot's custom series. So if you missed that first video, we'll link it somewhere here for you guys to check out that video. But in response to that video, there were a lot of questions in the comments and different requests from you guys who wanted to see the Pilot Signature Nib compared with a few other Pilot custom nibs that are found in their custom nib lineup. And I thought those are really good questions. So today's video is all about answering those questions. The Pilot Signature Nib, for those of you who missed that first video, just to give you a crash course on it really quickly, it is essentially a stub-like nib, but instead of having a very flat back, where the stub nib is ground to be really, really flat, the Pilot Signature Nib is quite rounded in the back. So it's kind of like flat in the front, it has a flat shape, flat tipping, and then in the behind on the other side of the nib, in the back of the nib, it's kind of rounded as a normal fountain pen nib would be. And for that reason, it's kind of compared to a stub nib, but a lot of people think that it's a lot easier to write with than a stub nib. And after my testing with the Pilot Signature Nib, I tend to agree with that because it's a little bit more forgiving since you can use it from different angles and it won't hard start on you as stub nibs often do. So in today's video, we're going to be answering kind of 4 questions. The first question asked us to compare specifically the Pilot Signature Nib with the Pilot Stub Nib. So we're going to be doing a signature versus stub nib comparison. The second question asked us to compare the Pilot Signature Nib with the Pilot FA Nib. So I think it's a question about line variation, because you get a lot of line variation with a nib like the FA Nib, which is a flex kind of nib. You get a little bit of variation as well. So this person who commented kind of wanted to see how the line variation from an FA nib compares with the line variation that you would see in this like fake stub signature nib. So we're going to compare the Pilot Signature Nib with a Pilot FA nib. That's the second thing we're going to do. And the third question that we got was, is it a good nib for left-handed individuals? So we asked our lefty, and I have the answer for you there as well. And then the fourth question is, what pens can you find the Pilot Signature Nib on? So this video is going to be covering these 4 questions. I'll just dive right in with the nib comparisons between the Pilot Stub Nib and the Pilot Signature Nib, as well as the Pilot FA Nib. So let's take a look. So this here is the very newly released custom 823 fountain pen in the questioned signature nib. So I'm just going to do a little writing sample here for you guys to see. And for a close-up of the nib, I will also bring the nib in a little bit closer for all you to see. Okay, so let's take a closer look at the Pilot Signature Nib. You can see here it kind of has these, it appears pretty typical, but if you look at the tines, it has sort of like a flatter tipping. And then if you rotate it to the back, you'll see that it kind of has this little ball at the tip, and that's what gives this sort of stubby tip its rounded back, which makes it quite different from a stub actually. So this is what makes it a little more forgiving. And let's look at it side by side next to a Pilot Stub Nib. So here I have a Pilot Custom 743 with a stub nib. So you can see here the 743 and the 823 both have the identical number 15. It's the same size, same gold composition, same exact nib except for the tipping that we're going to be talking about. So on the right hand here we have the signature nib, and on the left hand here we have the stub nib. And let's turn these around here to the side profiles and kind of get to see the tipping sizes of the two to see how they're different. So you can see that on the left here, the tipping of the stub nib is a lot flatter than this bulbous kind of shape that you see on the Pilot Signature Nib. And that minute difference, like on that level, will make such a big difference when you're actually writing and in the writing experience of these two nibs. So let's give them a try. So here's the Pilot Signature Nib. I'm gonna just do some figure eights to start with, and maybe you can see from the way I'm holding the pen, but this nib is actually meant to be written with on an oblique angle. So as opposed to writing with this nib straight on like you would a typical fountain pen, or like most people would a typical fountain pen, Pilot designed this nib to be written with on the angle like this. So it's designed for signatures. And it's designed to give signatures sort of a flair and a flourish that they might not have otherwise. Now, let's look at the difference in the strokes going down like this versus across. Yeah. So there's not a big difference, as we discovered. It is, Pilot describes this nib as having a double broad downstroke and a medium-sized cross stroke. The ink in this pen, this beautiful orange ink, is Pilot Iroshizuku Fuyu Gaki. So there you go. And then this here is the stub nib. So let's see how the line variation will be different. Okay, it's definitely a lot sharper to write with. As a stub nib does, it gives your cursive writing an accent, sort of, and makes it a lot more interesting, which is exactly the qualities that you want in the signature nib. But unlike the signature nib, this nib needs to be held at a little bit more of a specific angle. And this stub nib is not a particularly wide stub nib. So you can see here the line width that you get is a lot thinner than the line width. It doesn't go to like a double broad line width level. So the lines are a lot thinner. Now let's see the comparison between the cross strokes and the downstrokes. So going down and going across. Okay. So there's like a much more dramatic difference in the downstrokes versus the cross strokes here, whereas you get in the Pilot Signature Nib like a double broad going down and a medium going across. I would say this is like a broad going down and like a fine going across. So it's really quite different. And the stark difference is because of the shape of this nib, because the back of this nib has been ground so thin like this and it's super flat, that because of that, when you're going across the page this way, you get these really thin lines. And the ink that I have in here is Pilot Namiki Black. Okay, now what about this whole thing about like the different angles of writing and the signature nib being a little bit more forgiving? I wonder, I thought I would do some testing with just some different angles of writing, because actually this stub nib is, I would say it's one of the more forgiving stub nibs. There are ones that are a lot trickier to write with. But let's say I held the pen at like a more 90-degree angle, would it write? If I held it like on a more oblique angle, going one way or the other, would it write? And it does, actually. I think the Pilot stub nib is actually a very good stub nib. Like, it doesn't really hard start all that often. But you do get more boldness in your strokes because you have that double broad downstroke and that medium cross stroke. Cool. Okay. So that's a comparison between the Pilot Signature Nib and the Pilot Stub Nib. And now let's do a comparison including the Pilot FA Nib. So the person who asked this question wanted to see the Pilot Signature Nib compared with a Pilot Stub Nib, or like a Pilot FA Nib, I'm sorry. So I have here a Pilot FA Nib, and this is on a custom 743. So it's actually the same nib size as the previous models that we were testing. It's the Pilot number 15, 14 karat gold nib. And the FA nib is a falcon nib. So it basically has some flex to it. It has some bounce to it, and the bounce and the line variation occur from pressure. So if you apply a little bit of pressure on the downstrokes, you get thicker lines, as you can see here. I'm not a calligrapher. But you can see here the upstrokes here are quite thin versus the downstrokes here are really quite thick. So this is the Pilot, Pilot FA nib. And let's make a little writing sample. So with no pressure at all applied, which I'm writing like here, this nib is like a soft fine, basically. It's a fine that has a lot of juice to it, and it's like guzzling with ink, basically. And with a little pressure on the downstrokes, you know, God, please don't judge my calligraphy. But you can see here there's like a little bit of variation here. And I like to do this test as well where I do lines, down vertical lines with no pressure applied, with a little bit of pressure applied. You can see the tines widening and creating these thicker strokes here. And then with quite some pressure applied consistently across the downstroke. And that's what this pen can do. It can basically flex to create these really thick lines. So it will match and even kind of challenge those double broad lines of the Pilot Signature Nib. And it'll get you the finest lines here of like a Pilot fine nib that kind of match the fine of the cross strokes of the Pilot Stub, but you also get these in-between strokes as well. So a lot of people ask us in store about the Pilot FA nib for sketching, because you are able to create these different densities of line widths, as you can see across this one example here. Okay, so there was a writing sample of the Pilot Signature Nib compared with the Pilot Stub Nib compared with the Pilot FA Nib. If you ask me, which one to choose, I think it depends a lot on what we're trying to do. If your primary concern is line variation, I would say the FA Nib is your winner. You can create anything from a fine nib line variation to like a 1.5 millimeter thick line. That's my approximation. Maybe it's like more like a 1.3 millimeter line with thickness. And you can get, degrees in between as well, because this nib is so soft and so bouncy. That being said, it's not for everybody. That softness takes a little bit of getting used to. If you're looking for just a regular nib that adds a little bit of flair to your writing, I think the Signature Nib is the one for you because it's the easiest one to use out of all of these. The Stub Nib can be a little bit harder to getting used to, although I think the Pilot Stub Nib is actually quite good in my testing. It doesn't really hard start. It behaves really well, especially if you have a nice wet ink in it, like the Pilot Namiki Black or any Pilot Iroshizuku ink. I think between the Pilot Signature Nib and the Pilot Stub Nib, it really comes down to like how dramatic you want your calligraphic writing to look. For the most dramatic calligraphic writing, you probably want those stark differences between those thick lines going down and those thin lines going across the page, and you want to stick with the classic Pilot Stub Nib. But if you're not looking for calligraphic writing all the time and you just kind of want to show off your inks in a nice juicy pen and you want to be able to just write every day with it, probably the Signature Nib if you're not afraid of a very thick nib, because it is going down a double broad. So there you have it. It's not a succinct answer. I'm so sorry. There's so many details involved, but hopefully that answers your question. Now, the third question that we got was, is the Pilot Signature Nib good for lefties? So for that, we gave the Pilot Signature Nib to our resident lefty here at Yoseka, Alex, and we asked her to test the pen out, and she said that, yes, the Pilot Signature Nib is a pretty forgiving, stubby nib for lefties, and in general, it's a pretty forgiving nib for lefties because you can hold the pen at so many different angles to the paper and it'll still kind of draw ink out of the pen. So that's the whole idea there. So the answer is yes from our resident lefty. I hope that answers your question. And then the fourth question was just what fountain pens can I find the Pilot Signature Nib on? So as of today, the Pilot Signature Nib can be found on two Pilot custom fountain pens. The Custom 823, which I was showing you guys in this video, it's available on the Custom 823, and that's a very recent update. As of May 2024, basically. Pilot Signature Nib is also available on the Custom 742. However, the 742 is a Japan-only model as of May 2024. Who knows what it'll be in the future, if it'll be brought over, but it's not available here in the US, the 742. So you can really only find the Signature Nib on the Custom 823, and that's why it's a very exciting development in the Pilot catalog of products here in the US. So I hope that answers a lot of your questions on the Pilot Signature Nib. It's a new, exciting nib from Pilot, the newest one that we have. And I totally understand everybody's curiosity and excitement about this new nib. It's not every day that we get like a brand new nib from a company. In fact, it's quite rare. So hopefully this video answered your questions and you enjoyed it. And be sure to let us know if you have any more questions about anything else. And we'd love to make another video and help you guys out. Thanks for watching. Bye.